When most people hear the word moorland, they probably think of doomed heroines running across a bleak yet beautiful landscape, or the cry of a demonic hound being carried on the wind. I grew up in an isolated farmhouse on a moorland in the northwest of England, and the moorland that I remember so well was a very special place. You could walk all day and not see another person, and on a cloudless night, the stars were a symphony of light. In the height of summer, the grass would become tinder dry, and fires would break out and burn for weeks. Smoke filled the air, and it felt as if the world was on the verge of the apocalypse. As these seasons turned, there were crisp and clear days, and days of constant wind and rain. Snow usually waited for the new year, and when it fell, the moorland was blanketed with a thick layer that could lay untouched until it melted in the spring. I lived with my father. He had brought me up by himself since my mother had walked out on us when I was only 3 years old. I had no memories of her other than the ones held in photographs that I had seen. There were 2 photographs that I had treasured most of all. The ones of her in her homemade wedding dress, and with my father on a day trip to the seaside. She had the most beautiful smile in that picture. My father was a quiet and hardworking man. He only opened up to me about my mother once. He had had a drink which was not like him. As he stared at the flames dancing on the logs in the fireplace, he told me how he had blamed himself for her leaving, how he had been distant, focused on the farm and its endless tasks, and she had been lonely and struggling with a young child, miles from her family and friends. She just stood up and walked out the door and never came back. And you know what? I don't blame her for going. He had said and wiped away the only tear that I ever saw him shed. For all of his flaws, he was a good man, my father. I knew that he really cared about me. One special memory of our time together is last Christmas Eve. My father had been into the nearby city of Manchester on business and had returned just before dusk. He was carrying a long, slim box which was wrapped in white paper. I was 18 years old and should have been too old to be excited by the prospect of a mysterious Christmas present, but it turned out that I was not, and knew that I would spend the night wondering what was in the box. He put it on the kitchen table in front of me and said, "This is best opened while it is going dark, not after it has gone light. So there's no need to wait for the morning, unless you want to." I answered him by tearing off the paper and opening the box. "Wow," I said. Nestling in the box was a telescope. According to the leaflet inside, it was a 70mm refractor telescope with an adjustable tripod. There was also a fold-up map of the moon and the planets of the solar system. I was delighted with my present, and I sat there beaming. "Well," my father said, with a big smile on his own face, "are you going to try it out?" I nodded, hurried through to my bedroom and set it up by the window, and aimed the telescope out into the night sky over the moorland. That first night I spent hours turning dials and adjusting height and angles. I saw a lot of blurry stars and stars that might have been planets before finally turning my attention to the moon. It was 3/4 full and it had been partially obscured by clouds up until this point. But just as I was working the focus into sharp precision, the last of the clouds had drifted away, and I was left with a perfect view. The image that I was seeing sent a chill down my spine. The desolate, pitted lunar surface to me was both beautiful and chilling. I sat transfixed until dawn. Christmas Day passed happily, but I could not wait for it to go dark again so I could return to my exploration. I started by seeking out the named features of the moon detailed on the map. The ocean of storms, the sea of crises, the sea that has become known, Tycho and Copernicus, and so many more. I studied their shadows and their shape. A few nights later, I was continuing my study of the moon when a blurred object drifted across my view. I had no idea what it was. I frowned and looked out of the window with my naked eye, and I smiled. Flakes of snow were falling from the sky. I leaned back in my seat and I enjoyed the spectacle. I didn't get to spend any more time looking at the moon through my telescope that night as the snow fell steadily. It was late afternoon the next day before the sky had cleared. The ground, as far as I could see, was white and it would likely stay that way. Dusk fell and the temperature plummeted outside. Sheltered in my warm room, I settled down and put my eye to the telescope. It was around 1 a.m. that I saw the first of them. A line of brilliant light streaked across the sky, and then another, and a third followed moments later. I watched bewitched. I had never even seen a shooting star before, and here I was witnessing their glory through my telescope. More snow began to fall around 3 a.m. I closed my eyes for a moment to wait for it to pass and woke up with a start as my alarm had went off. My father did not know that I was staying up so late. If he had, he would have reminded me about the school exams coming up in a few months' time. That would determine whether I would be able to go to university. And at first, I was fine with getting only a little bit of sleep. But after a few weeks, I started to falter. I felt like I was in a complete daze all day while I was at school, and only felt fully alert when I was looking through my telescope. And then, in the second week of February, a new sighting threw my life even further out of shape. There was no sign of fresh snow in the crystal clear darkness of the sky, and the snow that had already fallen lay as close to a frozen layer covering the ground. Only the path leading to the house had been cleared. I had been observing Venus for around 30 minutes when I saw a new light just to the west of it. I focused on this and saw a bright white circular shape, but I could not keep it in focus because I realized that it was moving at speed, and it was growing larger. It was traveling in my direction. I looked out without using the telescope and could make out the light unaided. It was out over the moorland, but it seemed to have come to a halt. I had to go see what it was. I threw on the thickest coat that I had and I hurried outside. The curtains on my father's bedroom were drawn and I figured that he was fast asleep. As soon as I left the path, my feet began to crunch and slide in the snow. I was on the moorland itself by now and half walking, half running. I couldn't go any faster because of the snow without risking ending up on my backside. Every few seconds, I glanced nervously up and was relieved to see that the light had not moved. Soon, my house was a small shape in the distance. Behind me and the moorland stretched out all around me, a silent sea of white. After about 30 minutes of struggling through the snow, I was getting much closer to the light. It was circular in shape and large, at least as big as two articulated trucks stuck nose to tail. I couldn't make out any features. The light coming off of it was too intense. It was incredible and I knew exactly what it was. A UFO. If anyone had asked me a few hours before if I believed in flying saucers, I would have said that I had an open mind but I needed hard facts. Well, now I had all the proof that I needed. It was right there before my eyes. I came to a halt and took a deep breath. The freezing air of the night burned my throat and I didn't care. I had raised a hand in greeting. I had no idea if the UFO was inhabited and, if it was, what by. But I wanted to show that I was a friend. "Hey," I hollered. "Hey, I'm here. Welcome to Earth." Feeling dizzy with excitement, I resumed my clumsy half-walk, half-run, determined to get as close to the UFO as I could. But as I planted my left boot in the snowy ground, it went in far too deep and I fell forwards. A sharp pain shot up from my ankle and I ended up lying almost face down on the ground. The pain was bad. I felt sick and I lay there for a moment, taking shallow breaths, trying not to puke. When the nausea passed, I managed to drag myself up to a sitting position. I sat there feeling very sorry for myself, and then looked up and felt a whole lot worse. The UFO was gone. I slammed my fist down onto the snow and swore. Maybe it would come back, I thought. I could wait. But I was starting to shiver and my ankle was throbbing. I figured that it was twisted rather than broken. I thought I knew the difference, having broken my arm when I was 13 and remembering exactly how that felt. But even if my ankle was only twisted, it would be swelling already, and the longer that I sat there, the worse that it would get. I bit my lips and counted to 10 and then got to my feet. The pain was horrible, and for a second I thought that I was going to faint, but I had no choice. There was 0 cell signal out there on the moorland, and not a single house or vehicle or person in sight. Or a UFO, I thought bitterly. Feeling very sorry for myself, I began to hop and stumble and, at times, crawl home. It was going light by the time that I made it back, and I was in a really bad way. I ended up sitting in the outside step and knocking on the door and shouting to my father for help. He came out a few moments later wearing his dressing gown. He looked shocked but did not waste time by asking me what on earth had happened. Instead, he went indoors to get a duvet, which he had wrapped around me, and then he phoned for an ambulance. It turned out that my ankle was fractured in 2 places, and I was sent home later that day with a plaster cast on my leg. Earlier, while he had been waiting for me to be seen by a doctor, my father had asked me why I had gone out in the night. I was so tired by then and embarrassed by all the trouble that I was putting him to, that I couldn't tell him that I had been chasing after a UFO. I made up a weak lie instead about being worried about my exams and going for a walk and getting lost in the moors. I wish that I hadn't, because I felt much worse afterwards for lying to my father when he was only trying to help. I didn't get out of the house much for the next 6 weeks or so, and divided my time between studying for my exams by myself and looking through my telescope. I did not see any more strange visitors, which was probably for the best. And as time went on and the warmer weather of spring had melted the snow, I thought less and less about UFOs and the moon and the planets and the stars. I was busy applying to universities and wrapping up my preparations for my exams. In June, I sat in the exams, and in July, found out that I had passed all of them with the top grade, and I had been accepted to the university which had been my #1 choice. 2 days later, my father died. I was heartbroken, and to this day, I don't know how I got through the arrangements for the funeral. My father was buried in the village cemetery near our home. I stood by the graveside as the coffin was lowered into the small plot, and I knew for the first time what it meant to be truly alone. Back at the house, a part of me wanted to go to bed and never get up, but my father would have wanted me to go on with my life and go to university, so that's what I did. To start with, being at university was a shock to the system. I was in a city and I wasn't used to the crowds or the constant noise. There also seemed to be a boomingly loud party on somewhere every night in my student halls of residence, and when I finally found a good spot for the telescope, which I had brought from home carefully packed in its original box, I couldn't get a clear view of anything. There had been no light pollution over the moorland. In the middle of the city, the glare from street lamps and the offices and the apartments reduced the moons and the planets to dull shapes in the viewfinder. I was feeling pretty miserable that night as I packed up the telescope and headed back to my room. On the way, I noticed a girl standing in the foyer of the halls of residence looking at her phone. She had long blonde hair and seemed to me to broadcast self-confidence. I had seen her around before, and I wished that I had had the courage to ask her out on a date. But I knew that there was no way that she would say yes. Not to a shy young guy like me from the middle of nowhere. I stared at my feet as I passed her by, and when she said, "Hey," I didn't think that she was speaking to me. And then she asked, "Is that a telescope?" And I realized that she was. I wondered how she knew that it was a telescope, but then remembered that the box still had its label on it. Yeah," I mumbled. "Amazing," she said. "You should join the UFO Society." "The what?" I exclaimed. "You know, the UFO Society. We go looking for extraterrestrials, and when we don't find any, we get pizza and watch movies about space aliens." Her open smile made her look even more beautiful, and the thing that I wanted most in the world at that moment in time was to impress her. So I said, "Sure, I would love to join the society. I've already seen a UFO, but it would be great to see some more." Her eyes grew wide and she put a hand on my arm. My skin began to tingle and I actually felt lightheaded. "Do you want to go grab a coffee and you can tell me all about it?" she said. I told her about my encounter over drinks and a donut which we shared, and a couple of days later I went to my first meeting of the UFO Society. We met in a cafe, and after everyone had got a hot drink to go, we set off walking. There had been sightings of mysterious lights over a derelict docklands area apparently. No one was taking it too seriously though. There was a lot of laughter as we made our way there, and I felt better than I had in a long while. Things got even better when the girl that I liked gave me a kiss on the cheek and said that it was really good to see me again. I pretty much floated along after that. The old docks were a couple of miles from the campus, and it was after 9 o'clock by the time that we had arrived. There was nothing out of the ordinary in the sky above the boarded-up warehouses and the litter-strewn streets. The haze of a few stars made it through the pollution. People started to chat about what type of pizza they were going to get and what movie that they should all watch. I smiled and slipped away down a quiet alley. I had had an extra large coffee and I needed to relieve myself. Afterwards, I headed back to the group, only they weren't there anymore. They must have not noticed that I wasn't with them and left, I figured. I couldn't message any of them because I didn't have anyone's number yet, so I shrugged and I hurried after them. Out on the moorland, I never became lost, but there, in that unfamiliar place, I soon became disoriented. My phone was no use and the buildings, they all looked the same. I didn't know if I was walking in circles. I thought that I recognized graffiti on the wall ahead of me because I had seen it earlier, but I just wasn't sure. I was stressed and breathing hard, and upset now as well that the girl that I liked had just walked off with the rest of them. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I wiped them away furiously, clenched my fists and started down what I hoped was a new street. It was wide and dark as all the rest, and there was something at the far end of it, something sleek and circular. My mind began to race. Was it another UFO, I wondered, one that had actually landed on Earth? It was different to the UFO that I had seen over the moorland, smaller for a start, and where the craft that I had seen in the sky had filled me with wonder. I felt a brooding menace from this mysterious object. It was shrouded in darkness and silent, and I was standing staring at it and wondering what I should do, when a low hum started to emit from somewhere inside it. And then a light appeared near its base. The light flickered and suddenly intensified. It was so bright that I could see nothing else at first, and then shapes appeared in the light. They were tall and lithe. I couldn't make out their features, but I could hear them whispering. "You are ours. You are ours," they were saying. "Who are you?" I asked them in a shaky voice as they came closer and closer. I was too scared to move, too scared to do anything but watch as one of them reached out and touched me, just below one of my eyes. I cried out. An agonizing pain was burning through me. It was the most horrible thing that had ever happened to me, and everything began to spin, and I felt as if I was falling into an endless pit. And then I blinked and opened my eyes. There was a policeman standing over me asking me if I was alright. There was a police car parked nearby. I could hear the crackle of a radio inside. I had no idea how long I had been unconscious. I tried to say something, but my throat was too dry, and moments later, I passed out again. When I came to, I was in a bed in a busy ward in a hospital. It was an organized chaos, with nurses attending to patients, some of whom were being very rude. I lay there for a while thinking through what had happened to me out at the old docks. There was only one explanation that I kept returning to again and again, that I had had an encounter with creatures from another planet. A nurse who had been passing by my bed stopped and said to me, "Don't look so worried, we're going to check you out and make sure that you're okay. Then you can go home. How does that sound?" "Fine, I guess," I replied uncertainly, and she went on her way to see to another patient who was shouting about needing their meds. I had hoped that they would discharge me soon. I didn't actually feel that bad. Groggy and grimy, but apart from that, yeah, okay. I decided to go find a bathroom so that I could splash some water in my face. I really wanted a long hot shower, but washing my face would feel nice. I was pretty unsteady on my feet when I had managed to drag myself out of bed, and one of the other patients pointed out where the bathroom was. I wobbled along there and stood looking at myself in the mirror. I was very pale and there were bruises under one of my eyes. That must have been caused when the thing, whatever it had been, had touched me. I sighed and gingerly touched the damaged skin. As I did, a tear of blood began to fall from my eye. It trickled down my cheek, a thick crimson drop. I stared at it in horror, and then the pain began. It was like something had exploded inside my head, and it was throwing razor-sharp fragments through my nerves. I began to scream again and again. I collapsed to my knees and kept screaming. It felt like the pain was ripping me apart. I was aware of the door opening and someone standing over me, putting their hand on my shoulder, and then I was falling again into a dark and endless pit. This time when I came round, I was in a room by myself. There was an oxygen mask on my face and a drip attached to the top of one of my hands. I felt numb and nauseous and was worrying that I was going to vomit into the mask when a woman came into the room. "Welcome back," she said in a quiet, warm voice. "I'm Dr. Walters." She sat in a plastic chair at the side of the bed and continued, "I performed emergency exploratory surgery on you earlier after you collapsed. To be perfectly honest with you, I'm still not sure what was causing you so much distress, but I did find this." She held up her hand and there was something resting on her open palm. It was around an inch long and very slender and tube-shaped. Its surface looked perfectly smooth. "What is it?" I asked, my voice muffled by the mask. The doctor looked at the thing in her hand and shook her head. "Oh, I have no idea. It was lodged in your brain." She smiled, a tired and gentle smile, and added, "Still, whatever it is, it should not have been there, and hopefully, you will be fully recovered soon." I was in the hospital for another 3 days before I was discharged. I had had no more headaches and I felt ready to leave. I was not ready to go back to university. By this stage, I was feeling pretty mad with the students who had abandoned me, and I had gone off the girl as quickly as I had fallen for her. So I went home instead. It was strange being back. The house needed airing out, and though I had contacted all the power companies and banks and the like, informing them that my father had passed away, there was still a pile of efficient-looking letters with his name on it. I filed them all in the bin and decided to set my telescope up to take my mind off things. Only I remembered that I had left it at my university halls of residence. I went online instead and scrolled restlessly through news and gossip sites until they all blurred into one. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, thoughts of what had happened to me out at the old docks kept resurfacing, and I decided to do a search for alien encounters. Maybe I would find something which would help explain my disturbing experience. A lot of results came up and I clicked through a few at random until I found myself in a discussion group. There was a lot of strange chat, most of which made little or no sense to me, but a couple things that had been posted really caught my attention. One was about the poster's husband. It said that he had become withdrawn after claiming that he had been attacked by strange creatures that had emerged from a bright light. He had been suffering from a brutal headache. He had also been bleeding from one of his eyes. I felt a chill pass through me as I read that. It sounded horribly familiar. The post went on to say that he was refusing to see a doctor and she was desperately appealing for help. The second thing which stood out to me was from a man who came right out and said that he had been abducted by aliens, and that online was the only place he felt he could talk about this. It struck me that he was clearly isolated and scared. I sat back and thought, these people are crying out in the dark. They need someone. Maybe that someone's me. I took a deep breath and replied to 2 posts with the same message. I think I understand. I would like to try and help. Do you want to meet? The man who claimed to have been abducted got back to me straight away. He wrote, yes, and then the address of a cafe came up on the screen. It was miles away, but that was fine. I went outside and I opened up the garage. My father's old car was covered in dust and spiderwebs, and I was amazed when it started on the first time. My father had taught me to drive his car, and although I had my license, I was not an experienced driver, so I felt pretty nervous as I set off along the route to the cafe that I had brought up on my phone. A couple of hours later, I pulled up outside the cafe. It was quiet inside. There were a couple of people working on laptops and sitting in one corner, as far from the door as it was possible to be, and there was a young man. He looked around my age and was a bundle of nerves. He twitched and ran his fingers through his hair and shifted about in his seat constantly. I ordered a drink at the counter and then went up to him, introduced myself and took a seat. He didn't need any encouragement to open up about what had happened to him. I don't sleep so good, he said, and sometimes I give up trying and I go for a walk. The world feels more peaceful at 3 a.m. and it helps. Only this time I was walking through a park near where I live, and this insanely bright light appeared ahead of me. And then these really creepy looking dudes came out of it and dragged me inside this big dark space. Can't really remember what had happened after that. I think that I blanked it out because it's too horrible to deal with. But I do recall seeing someone else like me. Someone who was terrified and was being held against their will. The next time I have any clarity is when I find myself walking the same path in the same park. It was 2 weeks after I had seen the bright light. When he spoke, he kept glancing around the room as if he was looking out for someone or something. He was seriously on edge. I was trying to think of something reassuring to say to him, when an alert on my phone told me that I had a new reply on the Alien Encounters group. It was from the woman. It said, "My husband has gotten much worse since I posted that message. I don't think anybody can help him now and you should stay away." I typed my reply, "I still want to try and help, please." After a moment's pause, she got back to me with, "Okay, my address is below." I looked up from my phone and the young man's restless gaze had settled on me. I sighed. "Look," I said to him, "I don't have an easy solution for the hurt and confusion that you're going through, but would it help to not be on your own for a while?" He nodded and I could see that he was on the verge of tears. "In that case," I said, "would you like to come along with me while I go and see this lady and her husband? They're struggling as well and I would like to help them." He smiled for the first time since I had met him. 10 minutes later, I was following a new route. The man sat in the passenger seat and he was still smiling, and that made me feel good. Not just because I was helping him, but because I felt now like I had a companion on this strange adventure that I was on. We arrived at the address that I had been given, a large 2-story house in its own small grounds. The door to the house was open and there was a woman in the driveway, putting suitcases into the trunk of a car. She saw us and came over. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't take any more, I'm leaving." And then she put her head in her hands and her voice broke with emotion when she said, "It's a nightmare. He's not the man that I married anymore. He's become something else, something strange and frightening." "What do you mean?" my companion asked. She wiped her nose with a tissue before replying. "Last night he started to hurt himself. He threw himself against the walls again and again, so much so that he broke his own bones. When I begged him to tell me why he was doing this, he said that it was because they were telling him to." She went back to her car and put a final bag in, closed the trunk, and drove away without another word. I felt as worried as my companion looked. "Hey, you don't have to come in with me if you don't want to," I said. "I'm not used to having friends, so let's stick together," he replied and managed a little smile. I could tell that he was trying to be brave. He wasn't fooling anyone, but I appreciated the gesture. "Let's do this," I said, injecting a bit of bravado that I didn't feel into my voice. I went inside first. The house was wrecked and in every room I looked in broken glass and crockery was scattered across the floor. Furniture had been upended and smashed. Pictures looked like they had been torn down off walls. In the kitchen, the contents of the fridge and freezer lay smeared across every surface. My companion kept a few paces behind me. I could hear his rapid, stressed breathing. And then I heard a growling sound. It was coming from a room on the other side of the kitchen. I moved towards it. My legs felt like they were going to collapse under me at any moment, but I had to see. I had to know. I entered the room. It was dark and stank of stale sweat and worse. I covered my mouth and my nose to try and block out the nauseating odors, and I looked into the darkness. There was movement. There was something in there. Something that was crawling on all fours and moving slowly towards me. Over my shoulder, my companion said, "No." His voice was quiet and filled with terror, because he had seen it as well. It was a man. He had been a husband once. Now he was a creature in a waking nightmare. Dried blood had caked the side of his face under one of his eyes, and he walked on limbs that were broken and twisted. Snapped bones emerged in places from his skin, sticking out at grotesque angles. He looked up at me, his mouth opened, and he snarled. I could see that his tongue was a bloodied lump of meat. He must have bitten it so badly to make it like that, injuring himself, as he had done when he broke his own bones by slamming himself against the walls again and again, as his wife had told us. He snarled again, and then, in a low, guttural voice, he said, "I am theirs. They control me, and they are telling me that you must be destroyed, because you are beginning to understand." Fresh blood dripped from his eye as he spoke. "Well, we have to get out of here," my companion said. I didn't argue, and we turned and we ran. We did not stop to look back, and we were soon speeding away from the house. As I drove, I struggled to understand what I had been caught up in. The man had spoken of being controlled. Was it by the creatures who had attacked him, or were they controlling him via a device implanted in his brain? And would have I become like him if the doctors hadn't removed the object from my brain? I started to shake as I thought of this and was barely in control of the car. We were on a deserted country road by now, with trees rising on either side. Dusk was falling and I could only see a few feet into the woods. I knew that it wasn't safe for me to be driving. I pulled over at the side of the road and sat there, still gripping the steering wheel tightly. My companion was looking at me. He was pale and his voice was very shaky when he said, "That man said that we must be destroyed. Are we in danger?" For his sake as much as my own, I managed to calm my spiraling thoughts. and considered his question for a moment before replying. I think we're going to be okay. If I'm correct, the creatures have a direct link to a person once a control device has been implanted. Presumably, they can track a person easily enough as well, but my implant was removed, so they can't find me. We are safe. I looked at him and gave him a reassuring smile, but he was shaking his head. I'm so sorry, he said. I should have told you, but I was scared that you wouldn't let me come with you if you knew. A wave of sadness passed through me as I realized what he was saying. It's not your fault, I told him as a tear of blood fell from his eye. He convulsed as his face contorted in agony from the device implanted in his brain when he was abducted. I reached out instinctively to try and comfort him, and he turned to look at me and said in a weak voice, It's too late for me, but you can still get away. It's not too late, I said, but I was wrong. The air was filled with a deep humming sound and the road was suddenly lit up by a viciously bright light. They're here, he said. Run. Hating myself for it, but not seeing that I had any other choice, I turned away from him, opened the car door, and scrambled out. The light was close to blinding, but I managed to scramble into the woods and took cover among the trees. From there, I saw that my companion had opened his own door and staggered out of the car. I guessed a part of him, the part that he still controlled, was trying to get away as well. But he only managed to make it a couple of steps before the light had focused on him. He screamed and burst into flames. I covered my eyes. I couldn't watch. It was too horrible. After what must have been only a few seconds, a terrible silence descended. I moved my hands from my face to be met by a sickening sight. My companion, that nervous, lonely, troubled young man, was reduced to blackened flesh and bone that lay crumpled on the ground. He was dead. At peace now, I could only hope. And just beyond his remains, a craft had landed. It looked like the one that I had seen at the old docks, and as it happened there, figures were emerging from the light which radiated from it. They didn't seem to be aware that I was there, cowering in the woods, and I stayed as still and silent as I could. The figures were tall and slender as before, and as they moved closer to the corpse, I saw their true form. They were close to 7 feet tall, and their gray skin was hairless and smooth. Their eyes were dark hollows set in long, oval faces. They had no noses or ears that I could see, and their mouths were narrow slits. The mouth of one was moving, and it was bending over my companion's remains, which began to twitch and then slowly, clumsily rise. The hideously disfigured body got to its feet. Repulsion burnt inside me. It seemed not even death could free my friend of these foul creatures' tyranny. There were more of them appearing by then as well, I thought at first, and then realized that they were people. 2 men and a woman. They gathered around the raised corpse and then started to lead it back towards the vessel. I watched, gripped by shock because I had recognized the woman. I had only ever seen her in photographs before now, but I knew. It was my mother, and a new realization flooded through me. She didn't walk out on us all those years ago, as my father had thought. She was abducted, taken by the creatures when I was 3 years old. A storm of emotion filled me, and for a moment I had hoped that I could rescue her, but I was fooling myself, desperately wishing for something that could never be. There was no hope here, only despair. One side of my mother's face was streaked with tears of blood, and her limbs were twisted into unnatural shapes. Jagged stumps of broken bone protruded from her skin. She was under their control. The woman who wore a homemade wedding dress, who smiled so beautifully alongside her husband on a day out at the seaside, was gone. Held by fear and sorrow, I stayed hidden in the trees as she and others returned to the vessel. It rose into the sky and slipped away in a blaze of light, leaving me alone. The car was too badly damaged to start, so I set off walking. I made a promise to myself during that night. that I would do everything in my power to stop these hideous creatures that left broken lives and horror in their wake. I have never been a hero, but I knew that in my heart that it was time to make a stand and fight.